Margaret OSullivan stepped off the dusty train in Clearwater, Texas, her calloused hands gripping a worn leather satchel that contained everything she owned. The year was 1889. The small frontier town stretched before her like a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. At 26, she was older than most mail-order brides, with shoulders broader than fashionable ladies and hands that told stories of hard labor back in the coal mining camps of Pennsylvania. The arrangement had been simple enough. Samuel Henley, a local shopkeeper, needed a wife to help run his general store and bear him children. Margaret needed escape from the suffocating poverty that had claimed her parents and younger brother. Their correspondence had been polite, practical, devoid of romance, but full of mutual need. She had been honest about her background, daughter of Irish immigrants, accustomed to physical work, educated enough to read and write, but rough around the edges. What Samuel hadn't expected was the reality of Margaret standing before him on the train platform. She towered over him by nearly 3 inches, her auburn hair pulled back severely, revealing a face that was handsome rather than pretty. With green eyes that seemed to assess everything around her with sharp intelligence, her dress, though clean and mended, couldn't disguise the strength in her frame arms that had hauled coal buckets, back that had bent over washing tubs for 12 hours at a time. Samuel's face fell the moment he saw her. The other men waiting for the train began to snicker behind their hands. "That's your bride, Henley?" called out Tom Morrison, the blacksmith. "Looks like she could arm wrestle you into next week." The laughter rippled through the small crowd, and Margaret felt her cheeks burn with familiar shame. "I expected someone more delicate," Samuel whispered, loud enough for others to hear. His disappointment was written across his narrow face like a brand. Margaret straightened her shoulders, a gesture that only made her appear more imposing to the small man before her. "I told you in my letters exactly who I was," Margaret replied, her voice steady despite the humiliation crawling up her throat. "I never claimed to be a China doll." The walk to Samuel's store was torture. Women peered out from behind curtains, whispering among themselves. Children pointed and stared. Margaret heard the words that followed her like shadows: mannish, unnatural. Poor Samuel. By the time they reached the general store, Samuel's reluctance had crystallized into cold politeness. "You'll sleep in the back room," he said, not meeting her eyes. We'll discuss the arrangement later," Margaret understood. There would be no wedding, no partnership, no future with Samuel Henley. She had traveled 2,000 miles to find the same rejection that had followed her throughout her life. That evening, as Margaret sat on the narrow cot in the storage room behind the store, she overheard Samuel talking to his friend Jake through the thin walls. "I can't marry her, Jake. Look at her. She's built like a lumberjack. What would people say? My business would suffer. I have a reputation to maintain. Send her back," Jake advised. "Tell folks it didn't work out. These mail-order arrangements fall through all the time." Margaret pressed her lips together, fighting back tears of rage and disappointment. She had left Pennsylvania with such hope, believing that somewhere in this vast country might be a place where her strength would be seen as an asset rather than a curse. Instead, she found herself in another town where men wanted women who could barely lift a teacup without assistance. The next morning, Samuel presented her with a train ticket back to Pennsylvania. "I'll pay your return fare," he said, still unable to look directly at her. "This arrangement clearly isn't suitable for either of us." Margaret stared at the ticket, then at the weak-shinned man before her. "Keep your money," she said quietly. "I'll find my own way." She had no intention of crawling back to Pennsylvania in defeat. If Clearwater wouldn't accept her as Samuel's wife, she would find another way to make it accept her on her own terms. Walking out of Samuel's store with her head held high, Margaret ignored the curious stares and whispered comments from the townspeople. She had survived worse than small-town gossip. At the end of Main Street, she noticed a sign in the window of Murphy's boarding house: "Help wanted, strong back required." For the first time since stepping off that train, Margaret smiled. If they wanted strength, she would give them more strength than they knew what to do with. Mrs. Murphy, a stout Irish woman with kind eyes and flour-dusted hands, looked Margaret up and down with approval rather than dismay. "Can you lift a full laundry tub?" she asked bluntly. "I can lift too," Margaret replied. "Can you chop wood?" "I've been chopping wood since I was 12. Double quotes. Mrs. Murphy nodded slowly. "The job pays 50 cents a day, plus room and board. You'll work harder than any man in this town, but you'll earn every penny honestly. Interested?" Margaret rolled up her sleeves, revealing forearms corded with muscle. "When do I start?" As she followed Mrs. Murphy into the boarding house, Margaret caught sight of her reflection in the front window. The same broad shoulders and strong hands that had made Samuel Henley cringe now represented her independence, her survival, her refusal to be diminished by small minds and smaller men. She might not have found a husband in Clearwater, but she had found something perhaps more valuable, the chance to prove that her worth was not measured by how delicate she appeared, but by how much she could accomplish with her own 2 hands. 3 months at Murphy's boarding house transformed Margaret from a rejected mail-order bride into the most efficient worker Clearwater had ever seen. She could haul water barrels that took 2 men to carry, chop enough firewood in an hour or 2, last most families a week, and scrub floors so thoroughly that guests claimed they could eat off them. Word of her capabilities spread throughout the town, though not always kindly. "That O'Sullivan woman is making the other wives look bad," complained Mrs. Henderson to her sewing circle. "Yesterday I saw her carrying a full-grown pig to the butcher's shop like it weighed nothing. It's unseemly for a woman to be so... capable." The men were equally unsettled. When Margaret single-handedly moved Mrs. Murphy's piano from the parlor to the dining room, a task that had taken 6 men to accomplish originally, the local carpenter, Pete Williams, shook his head in disgust. "Then a man, it goes against the natural order." Margaret heard these comments but kept working. Every callus on her hands, every ache in her back, represented money earned and independence maintained. She sent half her wages to Mrs. Murphy for room and board, saved a quarter for emergencies, spent the remaining quarter on small improvements to her appearance, not to make herself more delicate, but to present herself with dignity. The boarding house attracted travelers, cowboys, and businessmen passing through Clearwater. Most treated Margaret with polite distance, unsure how to interact with a woman who could outwork most men. But there were others, rough men, who saw her strength as a challenge rather than an oddity. Buck Crawley, cattle driver with hands like ham hocks and breath that reeked of whiskey, had been staying at Murphy's for a week. He made crude comments about Margaret's mannish ways and suggested loudly that what she needed was a real man to put her in her place. Margaret ignored him until the evening he cornered her in the laundry room. "You think you're better then?" "Other women," Buck slurred, blocking her path to the door. "All high and mighty with your muscles? I bet underneath all that strength, you're just as weak as any other female." Margaret continued folding sheets, her movements steady and calm. "Step aside, Mr. Crawley, or what?" Buck laughed, moving closer. "You'll fight me? A woman fighting a man? That'd be something to see." What happened next became legend in Clearwater. Margaret dropped the sheet she was holding, turned to face Buck squarely, and said in a voice as level as still water, "I asked you once to step aside." Buck reached for her arm. Margaret caught his wrist, twisted it behind his back, and marched him to the front door of the boarding house with such swift efficiency that he barely had time to yelp. She deposited him on the front porch, tossed his belongings after him, and calmly informed him that he was no longer welcome at Murphy's establishment. The entire encounter lasted less than 2 minutes. The other guests who had gathered in the hallway after hearing Buck's raised voice stared in stunned silence as Margaret returned to folding laundry, as if nothing had happened. By morning, the story had spread through Clearwater like wildfire, growing in the telling. Some versions had Margaret throwing Buck through a window. Others claimed she had lifted him over her head like a sack of grain. The truth was impressive enough, but the town's reactions split along predictable lines. The women were scandalized. "It's unnatural," declared Mrs. Henderson. "A woman manhandling a man like that? What's next? Will she start wearing trousers and spitting tobacco?" The men were threatened. "She's too strong for her own good," muttered Pete Williams. "What?" Somebody needs to teach her proper feminine behavior before she gets ideas above her station. Were others who saw the incident differently? Mrs. Murphy herself stood firmly behind Margaret. Buck Crawley was drunk and aggressive. She announced to anyone who would listen. Margaret protected herself in my establishment. I'd rather have one Margaret OSullivan working for me than 10 Buck Crawleys staying under my roof. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, one of the few professional women in Clearwater and wife to the blacksmith, sought Margaret out the day after the incident. I wanted to thank you, she said quietly, as Margaret hung laundry behind the boarding house. Buck Crawley has been bothering women in this town for months. No one has had the courage or ability to stand up to him. Margaret paused in her work. I didn't do it for courage, ma'am. I did it because he wouldn't leave me be. Dr. Morrison replied with a smile. Courage is just refusing to accept unacceptable behavior. The conversation marked a subtle shift in how certain people viewed Margaret. She began to notice small changes, a nod of respect from the sheriff when he passed her on the street, proving glances from some of the older women who remembered their own frontier struggles, and most surprisingly, requests for help from townspeople who had previously whispered about her behind her back. When the Hendersons' barn roof collapsed in a windstorm, it was Margaret they called to help with the heavy lifting during repairs. When Mrs. Patterson's husband took ill during harvest time, Margaret spent her Sundays helping bring in their crop. Each task she completed with quiet competence, asking for nothing more than the satisfaction of work well done. Yet even as some townspeople began to appreciate her capabilities, the social isolation remained. Margaret attended church alone, ate meals alone, and spent her evenings reading borrowed books by lamplight. She was respected for her usefulness, but not embraced for her companionship. The strength that made her invaluable in crisis made her seem too formidable for friendship. It was during one of these solitary evenings that Margaret sat on the boarding house porch, watching the sun set over the Texas plains, when she noticed a lone rider approaching from the direction of the big cattle ranches outside town. The man sat his horse with easy confidence, and even in the fading light, Margaret could see the quality of his clothing and tack. This was no ordinary quand. As the rider drew closer, Margaret prepared to direct him to Mrs. Murphy for accommodation. Instead, he dismounted at the porch steps, removed his hat respectfully, and addressed her directly. Evening, miss. I'm looking for the woman who handles the heavy work around here. I've got a proposition that might interest her. Margaret set down her book and studied the stranger. He was perhaps 40 years old, with weathered skin that spoke of years outdoors and intelligent eyes that assessed her without judgment. Most importantly, he had asked for her specifically, not for the man of the house or someone strong. I'm Margaret OSullivan, she said simply. What kind of proposition? The stranger introduced himself as James Garrison, owner of the Double G Ranch, the largest cattle operation within 100 miles of Clearwater. Margaret had heard his name whispered with respect and occasionally fear he was known as a fair but demanding employer who had built his empire through shrewd business decisions and an unwavering work ethic. Miss O'Sullivan, James said, settling onto the porch step beside her with an easy familiarity that somehow didn't feel presumptuous. I have a problem that requires someone with your particular ... talents. Margaret raised an eyebrow. Talents would those be, Mr. Garrison? The ability to work harder than most men without complaining about it, he replied bluntly. The strength to handle tasks that would break the backs of lesser people. And from what I've heard, the intelligence to solve problems rather than create them. You've been asking about me in town, Margaret observed. It wasn't a question, James nodded. Word travels fast in a small community. The story of you handling Buck Crawley reached my ranch within hours, but it wasn't that incident alone that brought me here. I've been hearing about your work at Murphy's for months. Mrs. Murphy herself mentioned you when she came to look at some cattle I was selling. She said you were the most reliable worker she'd ever employed. Him to continue, sensing there was more to this conversation than a simple job offer. I'm expanding my operation, James explained. It's moving into horse breeding alongside cattle ranching. It's demanding work that requires someone who can handle large animals, heavy equipment, and long hours. Most of my regular hands are afraid Of the horses, they're comfortable with cattle but get nervous around spirited stallions and protective mares. And you think I wouldn't be afraid? Margaret asked. I think you're practical enough to learn what you need to know and strong enough to do what needs doing, James replied. Fear isn't always about courage, Miss O'Sullivan. Sometimes it's about experience and preparation. The offer was tempting. Ranch work would pay better than boarding house labor, and Margaret had always felt more comfortable around animals than people. Horses in particular had fascinated her during her childhood in Pennsylvania, though opportunities to work with them had been limited. What exactly would the job involve? She asked. It's helping with the horses, primarily feeding, grooming, training assistance. Some general ranch work when needed. You'd have your own cabin on the property, meals provided, and wages of $2 a day. Margaret's eyes widened slightly. $2 a day was 4 times what she earned at Murphy's. That seems generous for someone with no horse experience. It's fair pay for someone willing to work as hard as the job requires, James corrected. And Miss O'Sullivan, I have a feeling you've never backed down from hard work in your life. There was something in his tone that made Margaret look at him more carefully. Unlike other men she'd encountered in Clearwater, James Garrison showed no discomfort with her size or strength. He spoke to her as he might to any potential employee, directly, respectfully, without the underlying condescension she'd grown accustomed to from men who felt threatened by her capabilities. Why me? She asked. You could hire experienced cowboys from anywhere. James was quiet for a moment, looking out over the darkening prairie. Because experienced cowboys come with ideas about how things should be done, and most of those ideas don't include taking orders from a woman. My foreman, Carlos Mendoza, is getting on in years and needs help managing the horse breeding program. He's a good man, but he needs someone he can train from the ground up. Someone who won't question his methods because of pride or prejudice. And you think he'll accept me? Carlos judges people by their character and work ethic, not their gender. Or size, James said firmly. He's the one who suggested I look for someone like you after I described my staffing problem. Margaret considered the offer. Life at Murphy's had given her stability and independence, but it hadn't given her purpose beyond simple survival. The idea of learning new skills, working with horses, and earning enough money to truly build a future appealed to her greatly. What about housing? She asked practically. You mentioned a cabin. There's a small foreman's cabin about a quarter-mile from the main house. 2 rooms, stone fireplace, well water. It was built for Carlos's predecessor, but he preferred to stay in the bunkhouse with the other hands. You'd have complete privacy. The conversation was interrupted by Mrs. Murphy emerging from the boarding house. Evening, Mr. Garrison, she said warmly. I hope Margaret's been taking good care of you. She has indeed, James replied, standing and replacing his hat. We were just discussing a business proposition. Mrs. Murphy's expression grew concerned. I hope you're not trying to steal away my best worker. James smiled. I'm afraid that's exactly what I'm trying to do, Mrs. Murphy. Though I understand if Miss O'Sullivan prefers the security of her current position. Margaret stood as well, decision crystallizing in her mind. When would you need an answer, Mr. Garrison? Take your time, he replied. Though if you're interested, I'd like you to visit the ranch tomorrow to see the operation and meet Carlos. No commitment required, just a chance to see what the work would involve. After James rode away, Mrs. Murphy and Margaret sat together on the porch in comfortable silence. Finally, Mrs. Murphy spoke. He's a good man, Margaret, tough but fair. Treats his workers better than most ranchers around here. You think I should take his offer? Think you should do what makes you happy? Mrs. Murphy replied. You've been a blessing to my establishment, but I can see you're meant for something bigger than washing dishes and hauling water. You have skills that deserve to be challenged. That night, Margaret lay awake thinking about the conversation with James Garrison. For the first time since arriving in Clearwater, someone had seen her strength as exactly what they needed, rather than something to be tolerated or overcome. The possibility of learning to work with horses, of having her own home, of earning wages that could set her up for real independence, seemed almost too good to be true. But beyond the practical benefits, there had been something else in James. Garrison's manner that intrigued her. It had spoken to her as an equal, without the carefully polite distance most respectable men maintained around her. He had been direct about what he needed and what he could offer in return. Most remarkably, he had sought her out specifically, rather than settling for her as a last resort. As dawn broke over Clearwater, Margaret made her decision. She would visit the Double G Ranch, meet this Carlos Mendoza, and see if she truly was suited for the life James Garrison was offering. Even if the job didn't work out, she owed it to herself to explore opportunities that valued her strength rather than apologized for it. Little did she know that her decision to visit the ranch would change not just her employment prospects, but the entire trajectory of her life in Texas. The Double G Ranch sprawled across the horizon like a small kingdom, with rolling pastures stretching as far as Margaret could see. James Garrison had arrived at Murphy's promptly at sunrise with a sturdy mare for her to ride, and as they approached his property, Margaret began to understand the scope of his operation. Hundreds of cattle grazed in organized sections, while closer to the ranch buildings, she could see horses moving through smaller fenced paddocks. "How many acres?" she asked as they rode through the main gate. 12,000, James replied. "Took me 15 years to put it all together, one parcel at a time." The ranch buildings were substantial and well-maintained, a large main house built of local stone, several barns, a bunkhouse, storage buildings, and corrals, arranged with practical efficiency. As they rode into the main yard, Margaret noticed the quality of everything she saw. This was not a struggling operation held together with hope and borrowed money, but a successful enterprise built to last. Carlos Mendoza emerged from the largest barn as they dismounted. He was a compact man in his 50s, with graying hair and hands that spoke of decades working with horses. His weathered face broke into a smile as he approached. "So this is the famous Margaret OSullivan," he said, in lightly accented English, his tone warm and welcoming. The woman who made Buck Crawley think twice about bothering ladies. Margaret felt herself relax slightly. There was no judgment in Carlos's greeting, no uncomfortable assessment of her size or strength. He looked at her with the same professional interest she might expect from any experienced worker meeting a potential colleague. "Mr. Mendoza," she replied, shaking his offered hand. "Mr. Garrison tells me you're looking for help with the horse program." "Come," Carlos said, gesturing toward the barn. "Let me show you what we're working with." The barn was impressive, high-ceilinged and airy, with spacious stalls along both sides and a wide central aisle. The smell of hay and horses filled the air, along with the gentle sounds of animals moving and breathing. Margaret counted at least 20 stalls, most of them occupied. "We have 37 horses right now," Carlos explained as they walked down the aisle. 15 mares, suitable for breeding, 3 stallions, and the rest are working animals, or young stock. The plan is to develop a line of ranch horses, strong, intelligent, good with cattle, but gentle enough for family use. They stopped at a stall containing a magnificent bay mare with intelligent eyes and a glossy coat. "This is Isabella," Carlos said, opening the stall door. "She's our best broodmare, but she has strong opinions about who she allows near her foals." As if to demonstrate, Isabella pinned her ears and shifted away from the stall door when James approached. But when Margaret extended her hand slowly, speaking in quiet, soothing tones, the mare's ears pricked forward with interest. "She likes you," Carlos observed with surprise. "Isabella doesn't warm up to people easily." Margaret had always felt comfortable around animals. They didn't judge her appearance or find her strength threatening. Animals responded to calm confidence and consistent behavior, qualities that her difficult life had taught her to develop. The work would involve daily care, Carlos continued as they moved through the barn. "Feeding, grooming, cleaning stalls, basic medical care under my supervision. But the real challenge is training. We need someone who can work with young horses, teach them to accept handling, prepare them for saddle breaking." "I've never done formal horse training," Margaret admitted. "Did you understand animals?" Carlos replied. "I can see it in how you move around them, how you speak to them. That understanding can't be taught, either you have it or you don't." They spent the next hour touring the facilities. Margaret met the other horses, observed feeding routines, and learned about the daily schedule. Carlos explained his training methods with the patience of a natural teacher, and James watched their interaction with growing satisfaction. "The hardest part," Carlos confided as they examined a yearling colt, "is that these horses will be sold. To ranchers throughout Texas, they need to be calm and reliable, but also spirited enough to handle difficult work. Finding that balance requires someone who understands both strength and gentleness. Margaret nodded, running her hand along the colt's neck as he nuzzled her shoulder. Strength without gentleness is just bullying. Gentleness without strength. Can't get the job done? Carlos and James exchanged a meaningful look. Exactly, Carlos said quietly. As they walked back toward the main yard, James broached the practical details. The job would start at 6 each morning and finish around sunset. Though during foaling season or emergencies, hours can be unpredictable. Sundays are lighter duty, just essential care and feeding. Carlos lives in town with his daughter's family, but he's here every day to supervise and teach. What about the other ranch hands? Margaret asked. How would they feel about working with a woman? Most of my regular crew work with cattle, James replied. They'd have minimal interaction with the horse operation. But Miss O'Sullivan, I won't lie, to you some men have difficulties accepting women in positions of responsibility. If you take this job, you'll need to prove yourself just as you've had to do everywhere else. Margaret appreciated his honesty. I'm used to proving myself, Mr. Garrison. They had reached the small cabin that would be her home if she accepted the position. It was larger than she had expected, with a main room containing a stone fireplace, separate bedroom, and a small kitchen area. The furniture was simple, but well made, and large windows provided views of the pastures and distant hills. Previous foreman made some improvements, James explained. Added the kitchen, built better windows. It's basic but comfortable. Margaret could picture herself living here, reading by the fireplace in the evenings, waking to the sounds of horses. In cattle, having her own space where she could exist without constantly being observed and judged by townspeople. I'd like to offer you the position, James said as they stood outside the cabin. $2 a day, room and board provided, Sundays off except for essential duties. Carlos would supervise your training for the first few months, but eventually, you'd work independently. Margaret looked out over the ranch, watching horses move through the paddocks in the afternoon sunlight. This opportunity represented everything she had hoped to find when she left Pennsylvania: useful work that valued her abilities, fair compensation, and the chance to learn skills that could secure her future. There's one more thing, James added, quietly. I want you to know that if you take this job, you'll be treated with the same respect as any other employee. Your work will be judged on its merit, not on whether it fits someone's idea of appropriate feminine behavior. The sincerity in his voice moved something deep in Margaret's chest. How long had it been since someone had simply accepted her for who she was, rather than expecting her to apologize for what she wasn't? When would you need me to start? She asked. James smiled. Is Monday too soon? As they rode back toward Clearwater in the gathering dusk, Margaret felt a lightness she hadn't experienced since childhood. Tomorrow, she would give Mrs. Murphy notice, pack her few belongings, and begin a new chapter of her life. For the first time since stepping off the train as Samuel Henley's rejected bride, she felt genuinely excited about her future behind her. The Double G Ranch settled into evening routines, unaware that it was about to gain not just a new employee, but someone who would transform both the operation and the life of its owner in ways none of them could yet imagine. Margaret's first month at the Double G Ranch passed in a blur of learning and hard work. She rose before dawn each day, tending to the horses with increasing confidence under Carlos's patient guidance. By the end of her second week, she could identify each animal's individual personality and needs. Isabella, the proud bay mare, had become particularly attached to her. Nickering softly whenever Margaret approached her stall, the work was demanding but deeply satisfying. Margaret discovered she had an intuitive understanding of horse behavior that impressed even Carlos. When a young stallion named Thunder became aggressive during handling, other ranch hands suggested harsh discipline. Instead, Margaret spent hours working with him slowly, discovering that his behavior stemmed from an old injury that made certain movements painful. Once the injury was properly treated, Thunder transformed into one of their most cooperative animals. You have the gift, Carlos told her one evening as they finished the daily feeding routine. I have worked with horses for 30 years, and I have seen maybe 5 people who understand them the way you do. Word of Margaret's success began to spread beyond the ranch. Neighboring ranchers, initially skeptical of James Garrison hiring a woman for such work, found their curiosity piqued when they heard about her results. When Margaret successfully gentled a previously unmanageable mare that had injured two experienced cowboys, even the most traditional ranchers began to take notice. The social dynamics in Clearwater, meanwhile, had shifted in complex ways. Some townspeople viewed Margaret's new position with suspicion, spreading gossip about the impropriety of an unmarried woman living alone on a man's ranch. But others, particularly those who had witnessed her competence and character over the months at Murphy's, defended her reputation. "Margaret OSullivan is the most decent woman in this county," Mrs. Murphy declared loudly in Henderson's general store when she overheard unfavorable comments. "And she works harder than most men I know. If people have nothing better to do than gossip about a woman making an honest living, they need to find themselves more productive occupations." Dr. Elizabeth Morrison proved another unexpected ally. "Miss OSullivan has found work that uses her considerable abilities," she told her husband's customers at the blacksmith shop. "I fail to see how that's anyone's business but her own." Support meant more to Margaret than she had expected. For the first time since arriving in Texas, she felt she had people willing to stand up for her. It's not because they pitied her circumstances, but because they respected her character. Her relationship with James Garrison had evolved from employer and employee into something approaching friendship. He often stopped by the horse barn in the evenings, initially to check on the animals, but increasingly to discuss the day's events with Margaret. Their conversations ranged from practical ranch matters to books, local politics, and their respective backgrounds. Margaret learned that James had built the ranch from nothing after serving in the Civil War, working as a cowhand for other ranchers until he could afford his own land. His first wife had died in childbirth along with their baby, a loss that had driven him to pour all his energy into building his cattle empire. He spoke of these personal matters with the same straightforward honesty he brought to business discussions, and Margaret found herself sharing details of her own difficult childhood and the circumstances that had brought her to Texas. "I never understood why Samuel Henley rejected you," James said one evening as they watched the horses in the moonlit pasture. "His loss became my gain, but his thinking was backwards from the start. He wanted a wife who would make him look successful and important," Margaret replied without bitterness. "A delicate woman who would make him feel strong by comparison. I would have made him feel inadequate. A man who needs to feel strong by diminishing someone else isn't much of a man." James observed quietly. Their friendship deepened over shared late dinners after long days, conversations by the fireplace in Margaret's cabin when rain kept them indoors, and moments of comfortable silence while working side by side. James began seeking Margaret's opinions on ranch decisions, finding that her practical intelligence and different perspective often led to better solutions. It was during her 6th week at the ranch that the first real test of their arrangement occurred. A group of cattle buyers from San Antonio arrived to inspect James's stock and negotiate purchases. Among them was Harrison Whitmore, a wealthy rancher known for his traditional views and sharp business practices. Garrison Whitmore said after touring the cattle operation, "I heard you hired a woman to handle your horses. That true?" "I hired the best person available for the job," James replied evenly. Gender wasn't a consideration. Whitmore laughed dismissively. "Come now. Be serious. A woman working with stallions? Next, you'll tell me she can break horses too." "As a matter of fact," Carlos interjected, "Miss OSullivan has successfully gentled 3 horses that experienced cowboys couldn't handle. She has natural talent." "I'd like to see this phenomenon," Whitmore declared. "If she's so remarkable, surely she won't mind demonstrating her skills." Margaret, who had been grooming Isabella in a nearby corral, heard the conversation and felt familiar frustration rise in her chest. Once again, she was being treated as a curiosity rather than a professional. But James appeared at her elbow before she could respond. "Miss OSullivan," he said formally, "these gentlemen would like to observe your work, if you're agreeable." Margaret recognized the careful phrasing. James was giving her the choice to demonstrate her abilities or decline without judgment. Looked at Whitmore's skeptical face, then at James's supportive expression. "Certainly," she said, setting down her brushes. "What would you like to see?" "That bay mare looks spirited," Whitmore said, pointing to Isabella. "Can you saddle Anne?" The wedding of James Garrison and Margaret OSullivan took place on a crisp October morning in 1890, exactly 1 year after Margaret had first stepped off the train in Clearwater as Samuel Henley's rejected bride. The ceremony was held at the small church in town, but the celebration afterward took place at the Double G Ranch, where tables had been set up in the main yard under strings of lanterns that would glow as evening approached. The guest list told the story of how profoundly Margaret's life had changed. Mrs. Murphy had closed her boarding house for the day to attend. Tearfully proud of the woman she had given a chance when no one else would, Dr. Elizabeth Morrison served as Margaret's matron of honor, having become her closest female friend over the months. Carlos Mendoza walked Margaret down the aisle, having earned the honorary role of father figure through his patient mentorship and unwavering support. Even more surprising were the guests, who had come to celebrate the union they had once whispered about with disapproval. Harrison Whitmore had traveled from San Antonio specifically to attend, bringing with him 3 other prominent ranchers who had witnessed Margaret's skills and wanted to pay their respects. The mayor of Clearwater, who had initially been scandalized by Margaret's unwomanly behavior, now spoke proudly of having such a capable resident in their community. Samuel Henley had not been invited, though he remained in town, having never found another mail-order bride and continuing to run his struggling general store with increasing bitterness. His rejection of Margaret had become local legend, generally cited as evidence of his poor judgment rather than her inadequacy. Margaret wore a dress of deep blue silk that complemented her auburn hair and green eyes not white, as she was no blushing young maiden, but a color that spoke of dignity and maturity. The dress had been carefully tailored to accommodate her strong frame while emphasizing her feminine qualities. Looked exactly like what she was, a woman who had found her place in the world through her own determination and the love of a man who valued her for exactly who she was. James, splendid in his best black suit, could barely take his eyes off his bride during the ceremony. When the minister asked if he would love, honor, and cherish Margaret, his eye will rang out with such conviction that it brought tears to several guests' eyes. The reception was unlike anything Clearwater had ever seen. Instead of delicate refreshments and polite conversation, the celebration featured a Texas-sized barbecue with cattle from the Double G herd, music provided by Carlos's nephew and his friends, and dancing that continued until nearly midnight. Margaret, who had never danced in her life, found herself whirling around the makeshift dance floor in James's arms, laughing with pure joy. "Are you happy, Mrs. Garrison?" James asked during a quieter moment as they stood at the edge of the celebration, watching their guests enjoy the festivities. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Margaret replied honestly. "A year ago I thought my life was over. Now I feel like it's just beginning." The transformation had indeed been remarkable. Double G's horse breeding program had become the most successful in the region, with buyers traveling from as far as Kansas to purchase animals trained using Margaret's methods. She had developed a reputation that extended far beyond Clearwater. She was consulted by ranchers throughout Texas who wanted to learn her techniques for handling difficult horses. More importantly, Margaret had found her place in the community. Her competence and character had gradually won over even her harshest critics. When the schoolhouse needed repairs, it was Margaret who organized the work crew. When a fever outbreak threatened the town's children, she worked alongside Dr. Morrison, nursing the sick with the same gentle strength. She brought 2 training horses. The cabin that had once housed a lonely employee had been expanded into a comfortable home for 2. James had added a sitting room with large windows overlooking the horse pastures. Knowing how much Margaret enjoyed watching the animals in the early morning light, bookshelves lined the walls filled with volumes on horse training, ranch management, and the novels Margaret loved to read by the fireplace in the evenings. Their marriage had settled into rhythms that suited both of them perfectly. James continued to manage the cattle operation while Margaret ran the horse program, but they collaborated on all major decisions affecting the ranch. Their evening conversations covered everything from breeding strategies to plans for expanding their land holdings. Each respecting the other's expertise and insight, The townspeople had gradually adjusted to seeing Margaret not as an oddity, but as half of a formidable partnership. When cattle rustlers had threatened several local ranches the previous spring, it was James and Margaret together who had organized the ranchers' defense, with Margaret's strategic thinking proving as valuable as James's leadership experience. "You know what I realized today?" Margaret said as they stood together under the starlit sky, the last of their wedding guests finally departing. "What's that?" James asked, pulling her closer against the cool night air. "I spent so many years thinking my strength was a burden, something that set me apart from other women and made me unsuitable for the life I thought I wanted.
Oh.
But my strength was never the problem. The problem was trying to fit into a life that was too small for who I really am." James nodded, understanding. "Completely, and now. Now I know that strength is only a burden when you're not allowed to use it properly. When you find work that needs your strength, people who value your strength, and a man who loves you partly because of your strength, it becomes exactly what it was always meant to be, a gift." As they walked toward their home, Margaret reflected on the winding path that had brought her to this moment. The rejection by Samuel Henley, which had seemed like the end of her hopes, had actually been the beginning of her real life. Every challenge she had faced, every moment of doubt and discouragement, had led her to this place where she belonged completely. The Double G Ranch stretched out around them in the moonlight. 13,000 acres of Texas land that they would build into something even greater together. In the horse barns, Isabella and the other animals rested peacefully, secure in their stalls and confident in the care they would receive come morning. The cattle grazed in distant pastures, part of an operation that had grown more successful each year under their combined management. But beyond the material success, beyond the respect they had earned in the community, beyond even the love they shared, Margaret had found something she had never dared hope for as that frightened young woman. Stepping off the train in Clearwater, she had found a life where every part of who she was, her strength, her intelligence, her determination, her capacity for hard work, was not just accepted but celebrated in the distance. A coyote called to its mate across the prairie, and Margaret smiled at the sound. Like that wild creature, she had found her territory, her purpose, and her partner. She was no longer the rejected mail-order bride who had been mocked for her strength. She was Margaret Garrison, successful horse trainer, respected rancher's wife, and valued member of a community that had learned to see her clearly. As they reached their front door, James paused and looked back across the ranch that was now truly their shared domain. "Any regrets, Mrs. Garrison?" he asked with a smile. Margaret looked back too, taking in the sight of their land, their home, their life built together from nothing but determination and mutual respect. "Only that it took me so long to find where I belonged," she replied. "But perhaps we appreciate things more when we have to work for them." Hand in hand, they entered their home, ready to begin the next chapter of a story that had transformed a rejected bride into a woman who had found her true worth, and a lonely cattle baron into a man who understood that strength shared is strength doubled. The future stretched before them like the endless Texas sky, full of possibilities, challenges, and the deep satisfaction that comes from building something meaningful together. Margaret had learned that sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as rejections, and that being too much for some people simply means you haven't yet found the ones who will love you for exactly who you are.